Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the Post 66, Working with Grief. This is the second instalment in our grief trilogy from requests from Jess and from Tiff. And last week we did the interior work, exploring the nature of death and grief and life. And this week we take that show on the road a little bit, because we all have to work for a living. And so how do we align the death work and the life work and the grief work with the paid work that we have to do? And this is crucial. We have to earn a living. So how do we manage this interior complexity while going about our inverted commas normal daily business? And of course that was the request from Tiff and from Jess. So we're going to talk, and apologies for a cold, we're going to talk about grief while working this week. And I'm going to try and offer Tara's 10 tips to think about how you manage paid employment during this incredibly tragic and difficult time. And as I am doing in this trilogy, I'm going to start with a story. So let me tell you a story. It was an ordinary day at work, and an associate professor had made an appointment to come and see me so that we could organise a student stipend as part of a grant. So that happens all the time. I got my iPad out and welcomed the associate professor and started to take notes and so forth. And she was telling me what she wanted to do, and I was taking notes, and let's make this work for you. And that was all going incredibly well. But then about 90 seconds into this meeting, into this conversation, she started to cry. And it wasn't just sort of, tears coming down. It was the really tragic, deep from the well within us cry. And, she started to then sort of get up and try and shuffle out of the office. And I said, look, would you just sit for a moment? If you're happy, I'll close the door and let's just sit for a moment. And she said yes. So I closed the door and moved around from my office to just sit adjacent to her. And I looked at her and I said, what can I do to help you right now? And the tears cleared a little bit. The voice was still broken. And she said, Tara, I'm so sorry. This is my first day back at work. My husband died 2 weeks ago, and this grant has to be done. So I've come back to work to do this grant, and the people around me, the people who are working with me, don't really want me here. I'm making them uncomfortable, but I don't want to go home because home is worse. I like work and I want to do work. So I've come to work, but I'm not really managing. And then I told her, I'm so sorry. And I said, don't be worried about the tears. Very, very comfortable with that. You are absolutely safe here. Whenever you feel that tears are coming, please head straight to my office. We'll close the door if you're comfortable and we'll just talk. I've got plenty of time. Let's just work this through for you. So we sat together for less than an hour, about 50 minutes, and we punched out this grant. There were about 3 bits of information we needed to get, and we crafted those emails together to send to those people to get those data sets that we needed. And I got on the phone and said, if you could reply via email rather than phone this particular associate professor, that would be great. And that grant was completed by the following morning. Now, what I did and what I continue to do in the months and just about a year that followed was create a really safe environment for this colleague to know that there would be no judgment, there would be kindness, there would be hope, and there would be conversation. And if she was in a difficult space, she would have somebody who was walking with her. Now, every relationship should be like this in the workplace. And, it's very straightforward. Can I just say this was very easy? It was just being kind. Just spending a bit of time with another human being. So every single one of us can make a decision today to listen, to protect, to care for the space around another human being in a workplace. What we're doing is listening. What we're doing is showing compassion. Now, all of this is very easy, and too often it's not the case because sort of grief and tears and the fog and the confusion and the profound devastation are not welcome in most workplaces. And why? Because they make people uncomfortable. Ah, so sad. Many of us I know right now, today, you are working in a ruthless and a dreadful environment. Now, I know most of the time no one cares if we live or die. No one cares if we work or we don't. The focus at the moment is on enhancing the profile of an institution or a leader. And that word, that dreadful word is used all the time, optics. It's about the optics of the institution. Is it though? And of course, because of the focus on optics, a distraught worker, a distraught academic or student or professional colleague, that can be a bit embarrassing. It hurts the optics. Now, so often, too often in the last 20 years of my career, I've got a call from a senior colleague saying a particular colleague has lost their parents, lost a child, lost their partner, and would I have a chat with them? Now, I've always welcomed those conversations. But you see, there's a greater question there, isn't there? What is it with all the stuff about leadership that exists at the moment in our universities? Why is none of this leadership training that everybody's enrolled in, why is none of that activated human decency and human compassion and spent time talking about grief and death in the workplace as part of leadership? Remember, I've done a Masters of Leadership. There was not one mention of compassion in the handling of grief and death for a co-worker. Interesting, eh? Instead, of course, what happens is these complicated, difficult emotions are passed on to a woman, many women in our institutions, and this is what the legendary Piper Bell, good morning Piper, has described as the housework of our universities. So what's going on? How can we work with grief? So here are Tara's 10 tips, and please use any of the tips that are appropriate to you at your particular journey and story in and through death and grief and your particular workplace. So let's do this. Bang. 1. Here we go. Inform your line manager of the death. Now, I'm a big fan of boundaries, as you know, keeping private matters private and not taking the whole self to work. And you have experienced appalling leaders and managers who basically have the patience of Scrooge after taking A-class pharmaceuticals, okay? We've all worked for these people. But what I need you to do is, in writing, tell your line manager about the personal loss. Do it in writing. Why have I suggested it? Because your whole self has porous boundaries after a death. You are bleeding emotion. Therefore, when a death occurs or when your family member has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, in writing, inform your line manager. And why you're doing this is it ensures 3 things. Firstly, that bereavement leave will be available when you want to take it, okay? 2, that they will, with your permission and guidance, tell your co-workers this information in a way that you feel is appropriate. Now, that's really useful because you don't have to then endlessly go through telling the story of the death to your co-workers over and over again. That will hurt you, so your line manager does that and does that once. Brilliant. Thanks for playing. And thirdly, there will be some sort of context of support around you if something weird happens. And we're going to talk about the weirdness in a second. So you may work for a monster, and there are a lot of monsters out there. You may be working for a monster, but in almost all workplaces, including our universities, they have a policy suite that covers bereavement leave. And that means there is a minimum standard of social support that is available to you. So today, read the policies about death, sickness and bereavement and notify your line manager of the death or the terminal illness. Now, this is not for platitudes, this is not for sympathy, but it will allow the actioning of the 9 tips that I'm about to give you now. Tip 2, be kind to yourself. Now, your boundaries are porous after a death. It may not be possible for you to say the name of the person who has died. It may not be possible to answer, how are you going? It may not be possible to tell any personal matters to any co-workers. Okay, right. So we'll talk about all of that in a minute and saying the name of the person who has died. But know that all of this is absolutely fine. You are emotionally raw. That's what's happening. That's cool. You're cool. So what I need you to do is work on your timelines. Understand your strengths and your weaknesses as you are building these new boundaries. Now remember our diagram from last week. When someone you love dies, that death covers the entirety of your life. But as you continue to live in the days after the death, then the death and the grief is recontextualized. It's not lessened, it's recontextualized. So if you are able to keep breathing, wake up in the morning, have a shower, and continue walking, these are all incredible achievements. Firstly, right? If you haven't been through something as tragic as this, getting up and having a shower is tough. And if you are doing that, remember to personally acknowledge that achievement. Remember to start thinking about what you are able to continue to do, what you are doing, rather than what you are feeling is difficult. So this care for the self is absolutely crucial. And let me tell you why. You know, the sort of self-care, self-help stuff, I'm not a big fan. But let me tell you why I'm focusing on care of the self for you now. Let me give you the information that was so important to me. So from the 1960s, the consequences of grief on the humans that remain started to be revealed through quantitative studies. And there was a famous 1963 article in The Lancet that investigated 5,000 widowers, right? So big quant. And this study demonstrated that these 5,000 widowers had a much higher death rate than the rest of the general population. So from the 1960s, there started to be quant after quant after quant study that really showed the impact of grief and the death of a family member on another human. Now, Julia Samuels showed, hang on to yourself, quote, a bereaved person is 6 times more likely to suffer heart disease than the national average, end of quote. Remember that old wives' tale of someone dying of a broken heart? Like most old wives' tales, there is something there. And what that something is heart disease increases by 6 times after the death of a close family member. Right. And hang on to yourself. And this was the data set that focused my mind after Steve's death, can I say. Surviving partners were 66% more likely to die in the first 3 months to the first 3 years after the partner's death. 66% more likely to die. So you can see here by these quant studies the scale of what you are going through. So unless we implement these strategies that we're talking about, there are catastrophic consequences for you. We need to look after you. And this is before we start to talk about the alcohol abuse, the oxys, the medication, simply to dull the grief, what Case and Deaton described as deaths of despair, okay? And of course, booze, the drugs, create their own death spiral. There's also, I think, the existential, life-changing knowledge that comes through grief, and that is that events happen in the world that you can't fix and you can't change. So the death of a loved one so often is the death of a future. Okay. 3. Expect weirdness. Okay, let's do it. The bizarre thing is that, of course, death and grief happens to every single human being. Everything that is alive will die. Therefore, every single one of us will experience the death of a person we care about. And can I say also the death of pets is incredibly important here. And can I do a big shout out to all the members of our wonderful online community that express their incredible grief over their pets as well. Big area of the literature on that as well. Good on you for raising that. So for something that happens to every single human being, the intolerance for grief in the workplace remains an absolute mystery to me. Grief, of course, is inconvenient to the neoliberal project of a university. It's inconvenient to a doctoral program, to a research and teaching career. But just because it's inconvenient doesn't mean that it's not real or meaningful. And of course, it also presents a series of very unexpected responses and events. And that's why you've told your line manager. Okay, so let me just give you a couple of examples of the weirdness, okay? And so it's been 6.5 years since Steve's died, and I've been actually very strong. I've been great, upright, not having a problem, right? For 6.5 years, I'm okay. I'm actually all right. Except for 2 little events that happened in the workplace, okay? So this just gives you a sense of weird things happen to everybody. And the first one happened about 3 weeks after Steve's death. As most of you know, he died on the Thursday night and I went back to work on the Friday morning, right? So everything's fine. 3 weeks after the death, I was part of a meeting as Dean to discuss medical research, and that's fine, happens all the time, great. Big supporter of medical research, great. A decision was made on the morning of the meeting to change the location from a university office to an office in the hospital. That's great. Big fan of moving the meetings around. That's great. So of course I've got dyspraxia, so I got the map out to work out how I'm going to get to this new location. And of course the new location was in the palliative care suite where Steve had died. Okay, and I'm going, oh God. And the most amazing thing, and I've never really understood this medically, but I had a physical response to seeing that location on a map. I was shaking, I was crying. In fact, I'm getting a bit weird now, isn't that interesting? So a physical response to seeing on a map where the location where Steve had died 2 weeks earlier. So I told my wonderful line manager, Rob, I'm having a bit of a weird moment here. Do you mind if I come into the meeting via Teams? Came to the meeting via Teams, no worries at all. Still a bit weird seeing the location, even on the screen, but I was able to do the work. But an incredible, quick, physical response. Interesting. And the only other second one happened 9 months after Steve's death. And so I arrived at work early, like I always do, and so I look at all the emails that have arrived from the rest of the world overnight in antipodal time. And overnight, the special edition of the journal that celebrated Steve's life and Steve's research work had appeared, and the link was sent to me. And I clicked the link, and my name was mentioned a few times, and it was a celebration of Steve's incredible contribution to the planet, his contribution to intellectual life and a whole series of disciplines. It was a beautiful piece of work. But seeing Steve talked about in the past tense and seeing his work talked about in that way, it all sort of came back about the scope and scale of what we've lost. We've lost one of the great scholars on the planet. Besides the personal stuff, we've lost one of the truly great thinkers in the history of the last 100 years. And so all of that flooded back to me. And look, I was able to work the day, but I had to close my door and do meetings again via Teams, via the online environment. I was just a little bit too raw to have people in my office or be around other human beings, but I could do it via the screen. So as you can see, there are 2 events in 6 years, completely unpredictable, but recognize that weird things may happen, okay? And they happen in response to stuff. It may be a scent, it may be a food, it may be a photograph. So expect the unexpected and know when the unexpected happens, you are doing the best that you can. Rock on. Now, Daniel Dennett described this as, quote, narrative gravity, end of quote. So you're doing okay, and then suddenly the death will appear and narrative gravity, brilliant, will pull everything down. So what happens is your stories, your life might seem to stop, you're doing fine, and then narrative gravity will ground you. It's okay. Just remember that grief will surprise you. And for the people, the co-workers around those who are grieving, please expect these infusions of memory through a photograph, through a song, through a particular food. It can be weird, okay? And because we've got cliches encircling death, like of course the Grim Reaper, but also the Dark Angel, we've got these sort of, cultural figures that means this darkness and hostility, fear encircles death. Now, as Sue Black has argued so evocatively, quote, it's easier to treat death unkindly because in the modern world, she has become a hostile stranger, end of quote. Now, death is not hostile. Death is not a stranger. Death is not unexpected. But because it's treated like that, grief becomes this weird presence in a workplace. So you know what? Embrace the weirdness. Know that your grief is not weird. How death is treated in workplaces, that's weird. 4. Now, sleep will be interrupted and there will be horror movies playing in your mind. Okay. There are lots of consequences of grief, and they can go into very odd relationships with food and with booze. But all the sadness, all the fear, all the anxiety is increased. And the reason it's increased is you're not sleeping well, okay? And when you do sleep, you'll often be accompanied by these pretty horrific horror movies of the last few days of the life that just endlessly play in your mind. So when you can sleep, please sleep. And again, exercise, walking, do the grief work while you are exercising. And please, please stay off the booze. I'm not a drinker, thank the gods, I'm not a drinker, but the alcoholic problems that emerge in grieving populations, big literature there too, catastrophic. Be aware of the problem, okay? Luckily, I'm not a drinker and I was aware of the problem. And so I knew, don't do that. Seriously, don't do that. Brilliant. Now, look, go to the doctors if meds will help you sleep. You know I didn't. Full disclosure, I stayed away from the medicalisation of grief. I did my research, I did my reading, and I self-actualised. But what I would say to you is please focus on cleaning up your sleeping space. Now, if your partner has died, think about that space. Okay, now what you need to do at its most basic is new sheets, change the orientation of the bed, change the furniture, change as much of the bedroom as possible. Okay, a lot of people cannot return to the bedroom. Johnny Cash, after June Carter Cash died, never returned to the bed that he shared with her, never returned to the bedroom. He slept in his office. So really try and radically transform the sleeping space. You're going to need it. 5, do not allow other people to determine the length, breadth, and intensity of your grief. Now, of course, this is our weekly discussion of capitalism, dear friends. This week, we're looking at capitalism, death, and grief. Now, industrial and post-industrial death have transformed grief. So through the 20th century in particular, the funeral industry changed and it moved from undertakers, no, not the wrestler, respect to the Undertaker people, we moved from undertakers to, of course, funeral directors. That wasn't just a change in language. I've always had enormous respect for undertakers. Think about the word. They have made an undertaking to help the bereaved with the body and the coffin and move it between different spaces, right? So it was a partnership between a grieving family and an undertaker who had undertaken to help them. So through the 20th century, and I logged the truly wonderful Brian Parsons book on this area. Brian, you're a legend. What a book that is, Brian. Now, in the 1930, 80% of people died in the family home. In 2024, 80% of people died in hospital, hospice, or residential care. So, remember, my mother, hello Doris, my mother was born in 1930. So this incredible change to the locations of death has happened through one person's lifetime. So through the 20th century, death was regulated, formulated, formalized, sanitized, industrialized, and death started to take place in hospitals. So it occurred away from life, away from families, away from the family home. And mortuaries, of course, are completely hidden. The funeral, through the 20th century, became a quick and very expensive event. What it did was it compressed social rituals that take upwards of a year into an hour. So what it did was it squeezed social and economic and often religious matters into an expensive package that started and finished within an hour. So this was an industrial but also a capitalist death. And it tries to create efficiency so that we have a funeral, we pay a lot for this funeral, and it's over very quickly. It's very difficult to extract productivity, goods and services from the dead after the funeral. So the focus is on the living and keeping the living working hard and going shopping. Funerals exist to organize a group of people to respond to death in an expensive and time-limited fashion. Remember, what we're doing is we're removing the dead from the living as quickly as possible. So we're also minimizing the interactions between the living and the dead. And they occur in very odd and patrolled places, like cemeteries. So the goal of all these really rapid rituals of death is to convert a dead human being from a subject to an object, from a person to a body. Now, all of this makes the contemporary workplace a death and grief-free space so that the work can continue. And this makes all of us, to quote C.M. Park's great book titled Bereavement, quote, dead ignorant about death, end of quote. But also, birth and death are the only human behaviours that we can't practice. We do them once. So they're extraordinary every single time. Capitalism requires that even death, even grief, is quick, is short, is tidy. We can make money off sick people until they die. We can make money off healthy people until they get sick. So just remember, when people are trying to patrol your grief, truncate your grief, get you normal again, remember why they're doing that. Grief is inconvenient to the workplace because it makes people uncomfortable. Now, it wouldn't make people uncomfortable if we all welcomed and understood the rituals of grief and death rather than industrialise and commodify them. I always remember Sally Tisdale's great book, Advice for Future Corpses. What a great title. And she said, quote, in the vocabulary of grief, can I say vocabulary of grief? Brilliant, quote, in the vocabulary of grief, a grieving person has tasks. One must accept the reality of the death, feel the pain, adjust to the new world. End of quote. Brilliant. These are important tasks and they are completed on your timetable. 6. You are not the same person now. Grief changes you and grief changes you forever. Full stop. The desire for you to return to normal is about the comfort and the convenience of other people. After a death, your relationship with every other human being in your life changes. Sally Tinsdale argued that grief asks one question, quote, "Who am I now?" End of quote. Therefore, recognise that what you thought was terribly meaningful and important and significant before the death may be absolutely irrelevant now. And the scale of the changes, how you feel, how you spend your time, may be just breathtaking. There may be rooms of your house that you can't go into anymore, music that you can't listen to, food that you can't buy, meals that you can't cook. This is the scale of the granular and expansive changes that we're talking about. Therefore, ignore the people who want you back to normal. Move on, girlfriend. Move on from the grief. Move on from the death. You are grief. You are grief. It's changed everything that is important in your life. Your relationships will change, including your working relationships. 7, speak the name. Tell the stories. Now, we talked in our first post about grief work. After the death of someone, you are creating a different relationship with them. The death has occurred, but your relationship with them continues, but it does change. You are creating that new relationship, but it will take some years. Now, Mitch Albom stated, quote, "Death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship." End of quote. And in the first few days and weeks after a death, even saying the person's name will be too much. The first 10 times, the first 50 times, the first 1,000 times you say the name of the person that has died, your voice will break. You won't be able to say it. Now, therefore, in the following days and weeks after the death, you may find that compartmentalization is the best strategy. I don't judge that at all. I did it too, all right? So it's separating the grief work that you might do in the morning at the gym. It's separating the grief work from the paid employment. And that's a really good short to medium term strategy to re-establish your boundaries. Okay. The goal is integration, because death is part of life and grief work is part of paid work. Okay. But too often I think we think of death and life as a binary opposition. Actually, death exists in life. Okay. But enabling this type of integration requires, I think, compartmentalization first. So speak the name. And the first 50 times you speak the name, your voice will break. And that's okay. That's okay. But when you speak the name of the loved one that you have lost, what you're doing is you're making them present in your present, and you're building new relationships with them after the death. And as the time continues and your life work continues, it is important that you keep talking about them, summon them in the present, because you're developing that current relationship with them. Tell the stories, summon the memories. A person has died, but your relationship with them has not. Speak the words, speak the name. 8, be efficient and cut away the fluff and the rubbish. Now, this is a risk mitigation strategy for the paid workplace. What it's doing is it's focusing your energy on what is important. Now, paid work, doing a good and professional job in a paid employment sector is crucial. It's about being ethical and professional and rigorous, and all of that is important. It's also important for self-esteem, professionalism, building effective working communities. You are being paid to do a job, you need to do that job. But it's also about creating direction and discipline and purpose in your daily life. Now, as you know, I didn't take time off after Steve's death, and there are reasons for that, and I'll be really honest with you. The working environment, the paid working environment, was the coat hanger that allowed my survival. because I was able to manage other people's issues, talk about other people, care for other people, and that compartmentalisation allowed me to work on my grief work at the gym and actually care for other people during the working day. That kept me alive. So absolutely, work hard and contribute. That's important. But also, colleagues, be efficient. There will be times when you're not working well. Remember, the weirdness suddenly occurs. So when you are working well, work hard, work fabulously. But also, there's a lot of fluff that exists in the contemporary workforce that can be cut away. There's all this pretense about work being leisure and co-workers being members of your family. Stop all this rubbish, it's nonsense. Now, you may not be able to manage social events in the workplace, okay? The drinks after the seminar, you might not be able to manage to have a morning tea or lunch in the tea room. Don't worry about it. That's not work. Do your work, do your paid work, do it well. You're doing a great job, and if the sort of lunch with other people or drinks too much, ignore them. Don't go there. And actually, of course, to be frank with you, work should be about work. It should have a boundary around it, and that will allow you to manage your emotions. And speaking of regulating your emotions, 9. Know that people in the workplace will say insensitive, ridiculous, and hurtful things based on their dodgy models of death and grief. Now, this one is tough, and that's why the final instalment of this trilogy, which I think is probably the most important one, is the community-wide, workplace-wide, organisational post on how leaders, followers, we as citizens, we as human beings can do so much better in the management of grief and death in our workplace through what I'm calling, a lot of my recent work is doing work in this area, an infrastructure of care. Okay. This should not be an individual issue. Death happens to everyone, and yet for some bizarre reason, the burden is placed on the person in deep pain to not make other people feel uncomfortable. Our workplaces are based on people keeping their grief compartmentalised so that other people are not feeling uncomfortable. And because of this absolutely ridiculous ideology, your colleagues, your students might say absolutely dreadful things to you. And these dreadful things they say to you, you will remember for the rest of your life. They will scar you and they will wound you. And they will make your grieving process a lot worse. So if you are in that anticipatory grief phase, so someone you love is dying, perhaps in the active dying phase, then we've got to get you mentally prepared, okay? Because bizarre, tacky, and deeply hurtful comments will emerge from the people around you. They're inexperienced humans, and they will not allow you to find any comfort through your grief. You see, a grieving person is a reminder that all of us are going to die. And you have to decide every single time somebody asks you, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And you've got to decide what you're going to do with that question. You might just want to endlessly reply as I did, "Oh, yeah, fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." And just get that out, "I'm fine," and compartmentalise, get on. You know, and the option is you go, "I'm bloody terrible. How are you? I'm shocking." But that doesn't go anywhere because they don't have the resources to be able to handle the fact that you're bloody dreadful. They want you to be fine. So you decide what you want to do. And certainly the platitudes will start to make you crazy. You know, "Oh, he had a good life." At least you've got the memories. Yuck. And remember that most of the studies conducted about grief have embedded themselves into popular culture, and most of these tropes of grief and death are wrong and have been shown to be wrong. If you want to help somebody and you want to really have a sense of what grief is like, watch Ricky Gervais's Afterlife. That's about as close as it gets. And of course it's set in a workplace too, so you can see the catastrophe that occurs in the workplace around a grieving person. Okay, that's a very good model. But of course the Kubler-Ross model, the 5 stages of grief, is not denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, right? I'm only shaking my head because I think there's about 6.5 million references to this model online. And I read a lot of them this week. It was shocking. So, of course, this Kubler-Ross study is famous, but it actually wasn't a study of grief, of people that are grieving after someone's died. It was a study of how people feel and process the fact they've just been told they're going to die. They're going to die. Completely different scenario. And of course, the really interesting research that's happened in the last 15 years or so has shown that the data set that was gathered by Kubler-Ross, outstanding data set, can I say, magnificent work, great. But the interpretation of that data set was completely wrong. So the 5 stages of grief don't exist, and they're certainly not relevant to all people, and it's certainly not a generalizable model, full stop. Then of course we've got the Texas Revised Inventory of Grief, which has helpfully created a binary opposition of normal grief and, quote, deviant grief reactions, end of quote. The focus of this model is returning people to normal functioning as quickly as possible. So this study has decided that normal grief takes about 2 months. And after 2 months, this type of odd grief, deviant grief, starts to be referred to the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. So grief becomes a mental disorder. Oh yeah, great. So anything beyond this normal 2 months becomes deviant grief or complicated grief. Now, this study is poor in terms of, let's just do it, methodology, epistemology, ontology. It is what Stuart Hall et al. Described as, quote, the career of a label, end of quote. So grief is a label, and all labels have an ideological career. And grief is one of those. So what's happening is a series of master discourses from psychology, psychiatry, medicine has pathologized grief and arbitrarily confirmed that normal functioning should happen after about 2 months. And if not, if grief thoughts intrude after 2 months, that's a problem, that's a pathology. Now, this rubbish exists in the culture, supposedly verified by science. It's not science, it's pseudoscience. And we need to remember that we've got thousands of years of rituals of grief. Okay, some are religious. I'm not a religious person, but there are rituals of grief that have lasted thousands of years for a reason. And through many of these rituals of grief, the humans and the household of those humans are certainly granted a calendar year after the death to get themselves somewhat sorted, right? The year after the death, the anniversary of the death, is significant because we have a history that has valued that year to do the grief work. Okay, so know that all these sorts of popular categories and judgments exist in our time, and they result in some appalling behaviours and statements from the people around you. So why don't you just get over it? Surely enough time has passed now. These things are said to people in grief work. Now, you are the boss of you. You are the boss of you. And no one on this planet can know, really know, your interior work, what you're feeling. No one can know that. Now look, you're upright. You're alive. No, remember those studies I talked about earlier? You're alive. You are winning, mate. You're doing really well. But you need support to remain upright and alive. And we'll talk next week about how our workplaces and organisations really need to sort themselves out. And we as citizens, we as workers, we're starting to do good interventionist work on bullying and sexual assault and sexual harassment. We need to start calling out the behaviour of people who behave disgracefully to those confronting grief and death. And yes, number 10, expect silence and make silence your friend. Now, I study silence. I'm doing a lot of work on silence at the moment, and it's a powerful force in the culture. It can be resistive. It can certainly also be disempowering. But after a death, the silence is just pervasive. And why I'm a big supporter of people, if they choose to, returning to work quite quickly, is that the pattern of work is actually useful, and the busyness imposes a template of time over a suffering human being. Because you see, colleagues, after the industrial, post-industrial funeral, life is pretty silent. And the silence that exists on Sundays after a death will take your breath away. See, what happens is people who are grieving will go through entire days without speaking to another human being. The house that they shared is empty, and it's empty except to keep bumping into these memories that are not very pleasant. So create new routines for me. Exercise. Go to the shops. Use social media. Now, ironically, social media is really useful here because the screen is a barrier. You don't have to get too close. You can determine the porous limits that you're able to manage. You can stay in touch with people on your own terms, but walk away when it becomes too much. But be prepared for the silence and have some strategies to manage it. You're doing something that is incredibly difficult. It's also incredibly important. You shared your life with another human being, and that human being has now gone. So think about changing the surfaces of your house, join a gym, but also think about your soundscapes. This is important. You might want to start engaging in audiobooks, listening to music. Change your sonic reality as well. Create events, create activities in your life. And what you're trying to do is make sure that every day you've got the dance between life work and grief work and death work. And the other way to use silence is, of course, to write, which I recommend. Please write every day. I know this is tough, and I know people criticize me for this, but please keep in contact with your PhD. For those of you post the PhD, give yourself a writing task and do it every single day. You see, reading and writing provide a powerful framework for life work and the next chapter of that life. Don't give up on research, because research in particular widens out your frame, widens out your context beyond the self. Don't be frightened of the silence. Use it to move to a different way of living. So I thank you so much with my voice for joining me through this journey, through practical tips to manage in a workplace. And look, every single one of us will have to experience this. You might watch this video and go, oh, that's fine. I've enjoyed that post. That's great. Not relevant to me. Sadly, this post is relevant to everybody. Every single one of us will have colleagues, best friends, co-workers who this year will lose somebody they care about. So let's make a decision today to summon this grief-conscious workplace, dismiss the cliches, dismiss the platitudes, and please know this, that someone in grief is just about hanging on each day. And what you say, your behaviour, could save a life. Literally. So next week we're going to finish off this trilogy with a pretty robust and stroppy session about organisational resilience and how we can improve our workplaces and develop that infrastructure of care. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.